The true chosen ones never step on the pulpit. That sentence from Billy Graham wasn't thrown out casually. It was dropped like a stone into still water. Quiet at first, but the ripples never stopped. He didn't say it from a place of bitterness. He wasn't frustrated with the church. He wasn't denouncing anyone. He was simply testifying. And the way he said it made you believe that he had seen something we hadn't. Something holy. Something that ruined him for anything ordinary. He spoke with the weight of someone who had carried crowds, fame, and responsibility, and found none of it was enough. You could tell by the way his voice lowered when the subject shifted. It wasn't a teaching moment. It was a moment of unveiling, a sacred confession for those who had ears to hear. He wasn't speaking from a pulpit when he said it. He was sitting in a room with a handful of men, late in the evening, with the kind of silence that makes you feel like heaven is eavesdropping. We had gathered for prayer, but what we received was revelation.
No lights, no cameras.
Just the heavy presence of someone who had walked with God long enough to let go of everything else. That phrase, "The true chosen ones never step on the pulpit," hit harder than any sermon I had heard in years. Not because it was loud, but because it exposed something inside me that words never touched. I sat there, frozen. I didn't feel condemned. I felt searched, as if something had finally turned the lights on in a room I'd kept locked inside myself. I had always equated calling with visibility, ministry with stage time. I thought favor looked like applause, but Billy shattered all of that in a single sentence. And he didn't even raise his voice. And as his words echoed in the silence, I could feel something shift within me. It wasn't shame. It wasn't even fear. It was deeper than both. It was the slow, holy awareness that the truth had finally caught up to me. And in that quiet confrontation, one question began to form inside of me. Not out of emotion, but out of something far more dangerous: honesty. And the question was this: what if I wasn't called to be seen, but to disappear? That thought unraveled everything I had built. All the years spent crafting sermons, attending conferences, collecting moments where people said, "You're different. You have something. God is going to use you." All of it now felt exposed. Not because it was false, but because it was fueled by something I never dared name: the need to matter. Billy didn't say it to humiliate. He said it to free. And as I sat there, drowning in the silence that followed his words, I realized something terrifying. I had mistaken stage time for calling. I had confused volume with authority. I had built a version of obedience that still required applause to feel complete. That sentence didn't just wound my pride. It unearthed my foundation. He went on, slowly, with the weight of someone who measures each word before releasing it. He said there are people who were never meant to be celebrated, only trusted. People God hides not because they are weak, but because they are dangerous in the spirit. They don't draw crowds. They shift atmospheres. They don't advertise power. They carry it, quietly, carefully, like fire sealed in clay. And the moment he said that, my vision of ministry collapsed. I saw widows who pray while the world sleeps. Men who intercede for nations no one knows they've touched. Women who carry healing in their hands but will never hold a microphone. I saw them all shadows in the kingdom, yet pillars in heaven. And I felt so small, so loud, so unnecessary. But Billy didn't leave us in that silence. He looked up, eyes calm, and said, "If you can walk with God in obscurity, then maybe, just maybe, you're actually chosen." That sentence didn't close the moment. It opened a wound, one I didn't want healed too quickly. And as I sat there, stripped of every illusion, I knew this wasn't just a new message to preach. It was an old lie being buried alive. That night, I went home without speaking. Not to friends, not to God. I needed the silence to settle in. I needed to hear what my soul was trying to say underneath the noise I had called ministry for so long. Something inside me had cracked wide open, and I didn't want to patch it too quickly. I could feel it. The old version of me, the one addicted to affirmation, was dying. And this time, I wasn't going to stop it. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror, not to check my appearance, but to confront the person I had been performing as. How many of my sermons were born out of revelation? And how many were rehearsed performances meant to impress people more than please God? How many times did I post something for God, but secretly waited for likes, comments, and invitations? I didn't like the answers, and I didn't try to justify them. Instead, I sat in the middle of my room and said nothing. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to feel spiritual. I wasn't trying to stir up inspiration. I wasn't even trying to pray. I was just still. And in that stillness, something ancient began to awaken in me. Something holy and unmarketable. Something that didn't need to be posted, promoted, or shared. Presence. Raw, unfiltered, unpolished presence. Suddenly, I remembered something Billy said after the meeting, something no one recorded. He said, "You can either feed your gift or bury your pride, but very few ever do both." And that hit deeper than anything I'd ever read in a leadership book. I realized then, the pulpit hadn't ruined me. I had ruined myself chasing it. And it wasn't because I wasn't called. It was because I was afraid that if I stayed hidden, I'd be forgotten. But what if that's where the real ones are? What if obscurity isn't a punishment, but a privilege? That thought began to stir in me like a quiet revolution. One I couldn't unsee, one I couldn't unhear. And before I even realized it, I was being led somewhere deeper. Deeper didn't mean louder. It didn't mean more anointing, more preaching engagements, or more recognition. It meant emptier, quieter, and that silence began to expose things I never confessed, even to myself. Not sins of action, but of intention. I started to see how many of my yes to God were actually negotiations. I would serve, yes, but only if I could be seen. I would sacrifice, but only if the reward was public. The deeper I went, the more I saw the cracks. And not just in my ministry, in my identity. I wasn't a servant. I was an addict, addicted to influence, addicted to being known, addicted to proving to everyone, including God, that I was useful. But usefulness is not the same as faithfulness. One impresses people. The other breaks you in half before God. And as I sat in that inner collapse, the words of Billy Graham echoed again. The true chosen ones never step on the pulpit, not because they are lesser, but because they are trusted with more weight, more silence, more hiddenness. God doesn't hide the weak. He hides the dangerous. And I realized then, I wasn't being sidelined. I was being sanctified. Each day I stopped trying to be called and started learning how to be quiet. Each morning, I stopped rehearsing sermons in my mind and started letting God confront the ones I had preached for the wrong reasons. And the less I said, the more He revealed. Not about others, about me. And that's when I learned the most painful lesson of all. Sometimes the reason God doesn't give you a pulpit is because your pride would preach louder than your words. That truth didn't destroy me. It invited me to finally surrender. And as I did, I felt something shift again. But this time it wasn't guilt. It wasn't collapse. It was a door opening. I didn't know where the door led. It wasn't physical. It wasn't even emotional. It was spiritual, an inner shift that felt like a quiet invitation into somewhere few are willing to go. Place beyond ambition, beyond approval. A place where nothing you've built for yourself can enter with you. And stepping through it meant one thing. I had to let go of everything I thought made me valuable. As I walked deeper into that space, I began to see shadows, not the kind that hide, but the kind that protect. These were people I had never noticed before. Saints without stages, prophets without followers, intercessors whose names no one would ever know. And that was the point. They weren't less spiritual. They were more surrendered. They didn't fight for a platform. They fought in secret wars that changed history in ways only heaven records. And then it hit me. What if God's greatest soldiers never wear a mic? What if the real revival isn't in the spotlight, but in the silence? I remembered Billy saying something once that never left me. Something so quiet I almost missed it. You'll never know who the real warriors are, because they don't post victories. They carry scars. That sentence cut through everything I thought I understood about ministry. I had spent so much of my life trying to appear faithful, trying to look anointed, trying to sound like someone who mattered. But these people, these hidden ones, they didn't care how they looked. They didn't even care if they were remembered. They just wanted to obey. And that obedience wasn't loud. It was costly. They woke up in the night to pray for nations. They fasted when no one asked them to. They wept over cities that would never know their names. And while I had been chasing relevance, they had been holding back judgment. Suddenly, I didn't want the pulpit anymore. I wanted the weight they carried, even if it crushed me. Because now I knew the ones God hides are often the ones carrying the heaviest glory. And the rebuilding didn't come through power. It came through permission, the kind God gives when He sees you finally let go of your obsession with being used. I stopped asking Him to raise me up. I stopped praying for open doors. Instead, I asked for something far more dangerous, to be made trustworthy in secret. That prayer undid me, because when you ask God to trust you with what no one sees, He doesn't give you fame. He gives you fire. Fire that purifies, not promotes. Fire that isolates, not elevates. Fire that reveals the impurities that applause kept hidden for years. And one by one, the layers began to burn. Ego, image, entitlement, insecurity disguised as confidence. I saw my calling not as a right to be heard, but a burden to be carried. Quietly, privately, and in that realization, I stopped trying to launch anything. I started asking God to teach me how to carry weight without needing an audience. How to walk into rooms, pray, and leave unnoticed, and be satisfied knowing heaven took attendance. There's a moment in every true calling when God tests not your gift, but your silence. Not your power, but your restraint. And that moment came to me in the form of a question. If no one ever credits you, would you still carry the cross? I couldn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew the truth was buried deeper than words. So I waited. I let the question sit. I let it challenge everything I thought I knew about obedience. And in that stillness, something holy happened. I began to fall in love with hiddenness. Not as punishment, but as presence. Not as isolation, but as intimacy. I began to see that some altars aren't built for public fire. They're carved in caves, soaked in silence, and lit only by the breath of God. And as that revelation took root, I felt it, the weight shift inside me. The craving to be seen had finally died. And in its place, a new hunger was born, to be found faithful in the unts. And that's when I finally understood what Billy Graham had meant. Not just with words, but with his life. He didn't say, the true chosen ones never step on the pulpit to discourage us. He said it to invite us, to call us out of performance, and into presence, out of visibility, and into vision. Because the truth is, some mantles are too heavy to be worn in public. I looked back on every stage I had ever stood on, every post I'd made, every moment I thought was breakthrough. And suddenly, they didn't matter. Not because they were wrong, but because I finally saw what they had blinded me to. Obscurity isn't the absence of calling. It's the evidence of one. God doesn't hide the irrelevant. He hides the dangerous. He hides those who can't be bought. He hides those who weep when no one is watching. He hides those who don't need applause to feel alive, because they already died to that long ago. And slowly, I began to realize that I didn't miss the pulpit. I missed the secret place. Not the one where I prepared sermons, but the one where sermons no longer mattered. The place where groaning replaced language. Where stillness replaced strategy. Where God didn't speak to be quoted, He spoke to be obeyed. I started to see people differently too. I stopped being impressed by charisma and started looking for scars. I stopped chasing fire and started noticing who could carry it without burning everything down around them. I started to honor the ones who never went viral but never missed a moment with God. And it was in that moment, that quiet, hidden place, that I heard something again. Not from a preacher, not from a mentor, but from the same voice that started this journey. And it didn't ask for a sermon. It asked for surrender. And this time I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask what the surrender would cost. I didn't ask what I might lose or who would forget me. I simply let go. Let go of the voice that kept whispering, "You're wasting your gift if no one sees it." Let go of the fear that being hidden meant being passed over. Let go of the version of me that needed to be important more than I needed to be holy. Because now I understood. Obedience in silence is louder in heaven than any sermon on earth. I stopped measuring my impact by numbers, invitations, or reach. I started asking different questions. Did I listen when God whispered? Did I pray when no one asked? Did I love the ones who could give me nothing in return? That's the real measure. Not the size of the crowd, but the size of the cross you're willing to carry alone. And that's when the voice returned, not loud, not dramatic, gentle,
familiar,
fierce. It said, "Now I can trust you." I wept, not from emotion, but from recognition, because I had spent years trying to be used, when all God ever wanted was for me to be known. Billy Graham wasn't warning us away from the pulpit. He was reminding us that the pulpit doesn't define the chosen. Obedience does, surrender does, hiddenness does, and now I see it clearly. Maybe the greatest sermons are never preached out loud. Maybe the real revival doesn't come through microphones, but through men and women who walk into rooms no one sees, and change them forever without ever being noticed. And maybe, just maybe, the ones God hides the longest are the ones He trusts the most.